What if I told you that for the indigenous peoples of the American prairies, heavy rain was not a natural disaster, but a long-awaited ally? While European settlers wrapped themselves in raincoats and tried to save their gunpowder from the damp, the warriors of the plains saw the bad weather as the perfect cover. Nature gave them the tools to turn the dead of night into an arena for the most daring and silent operations. Watch the video to the end to find out how one rainy night could change the outcome of months of confrontation, and why Native Americans considered water from the sky a blessing for warriors. I discovered this by accident while studying the stealth tactics of the Great Plains tribes. During a heavy rainstorm, the drops hitting the leather covers of teepees or dry grass created a dense sound barrier. The Comanche and Lakota knew that at such moments the vigilance of the sentries dropped, and the sounds of footsteps were completely dissolved in the noise of the elements. This allowed warriors to get close to the most heavily guarded horse pens. The night rain became an invisible cloak for them, hiding any acoustic mistakes made by the attackers. It was on such nights that the most daring horse thefts took place, with the enemy only discovering the loss in the morning. The success of the operation depended on how accurately the leader of the detachment could calculate the peak of the storm. The sound of falling water created the perfect background for silently cutting the leather straps on the horse's legs. It is important to understand that for the Indians, the sound of rain was not a hindrance, but a kind of music of victory. The roar of the raindrops allowed the fighters to communicate with each other, using quiet signals that imitated the sounds of nature. The enemy inside their tents heard only the monotonous hum of the water and lost their vigilance. This gave the attackers a head start in those critical minutes. Each warrior in the squad knew in advance his place and task in this water symphony. They moved in sync, using gusts of wind to hide the rustle of their leather moccasins. The rain literally washed away the sound of their presence, making them ghosts of the night. Even the most sensitive dogs often did not react to strangers because of the confusing streams of water. Interestingly, Native Americans from northern regions, such as the Cree, used cold rain for even more sudden attacks. They knew that the cold forced sentries to hide their faces in their collars and look around less often. This psychological state of the enemy was the key to successfully infiltrating the camp. Water became a tool that paralyzed the defenders' will to actively observe. Streams of water flowing down the folds of the terrain helped the warriors determine safe approaches. They watched how the drops hit obstacles in order to avoid dry branches. Each step was calculated based on the rhythm of the falling drops. This required tremendous patience and years of practice living in the wild. We would be very interested to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think about how such simple forces of nature have influenced the history of entire peoples? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new facts. Want to know the main secret of the Apache and Lakota warriors that made them elusive? The main problem for any group on the prairie was being exposed by hoofprints on soft soil. However, heavy rain instantly washed away the soil and completely concealed the direction of the group's movement. The Indians of the Great Plains used this time to make a sharp retreat maneuver. As long as the soil remained wet and pliable, the rain continued to work in favor of the retreating warriors. Cavalry trackers were furious when fresh tracks literally melted before their eyes. This allowed small groups of Cheyenne to disappear into thin air, even when they were very close to their pursuers. The rain was their best eraser, wiping away the history of their movements. Often, the warriors deliberately chose routes through lowlands that filled with water most quickly during a downpour. They knew that the streams of water would not only hide their tracks, but also make it difficult for service dogs to do their job. The smell of humans was quickly washed away and carried off with the mud. This made pursuit virtually impossible for anyone who relied on sight or smell. The skill of the Lakota trackers allowed them to read tracks even in heavy rain. They noticed the smallest flattened blades of grass that had not yet had time to straighten under the blows of the raindrops. At the same time, they skillfully concealed their own tracks by stepping on rocks or hard patches of turf. It was a complex science of survival, accessible only to the true masters of these lands. When the group realized that a storm was coming, it was a signal to move quickly. They could cover huge distances, knowing that they were leaving clean ground behind them. The enemy, who decided to wait out the storm, found themselves at a serious disadvantage. In the morning, a pristine plain stretched out before their pursuers without a single sign of human presence. The secret of their success lay in their complete lack of fear of the raging elements. Where soldiers sought shelter under a wagon, the Indians continued on their way to their goal. This gave them a tremendous advantage in maneuverability and surprise. Rain was a natural part of their military planning. In the next chapter, you will learn how Native Americans used humidity to prepare their unique equipment. Can you guess what changes occurred to their bows and bowstrings in conditions of high humidity? What do you think about this ability to blend into nature? You've probably never heard of this unique secret because it has to do with the physical properties of materials. The biggest and most unusual trick was using moisture to adjust leather goods and shields. The damp night air made rawhide more elastic, allowing warriors to fit their equipment more snugly. Leather straps stretched slightly when wet and tighten with incredible force when dry. Crow warriors deliberately exposed certain parts of their harnesses to the rain to harden them. Moisture also affected the grip of leather-wrapped knife handles, making them more reliable. At night, the leather parts acquired the necessary softness for completely silent movement. It was a subtle knowledge of the properties of the surrounding materials that helped in battle. Interestingly, moisture helped maintain the elasticity of the tendons that held the bow parts together. Too dry air could make the glue brittle, and rain restored its necessary viscosity. Experienced craftsmen knew how to protect the bowstring from excessive moisture using animal fat. They rubbed the weapon with special compounds that repelled water droplets. Shields made of thick bison leather became slightly heavier in the rain, but gained additional viscosity. A bullet or arrow could ricochet off a wet surface at a different angle. Warriors took this factor into account when planning skirmishes in bad weather. It was a practical application of physics in the wild. Deerskin clothing also required special care on rainy nights. Moccasins became soft and allowed for a better feel of the ground beneath the feet. This was critical for silently sneaking up on sentries in an enemy camp. Each step became more precise and controlled. The tribe's craftsmen spent years studying how different types of wood react to moisture. They chose branches for their spears and bows that did not warp from dampness. This was fundamental knowledge passed down through oral tradition. Water was an indicator of the quality of their work. If you are amazed by how deeply these people understood nature, please like this video. It is very important for us to see your support so that we can produce even more interesting content about Native American culture. Your attention helps our channel grow and find new and unique facts. What you are about to learn will completely change your perception of the night combat tactics of those years. Native Americans considered thunder and lightning to be signs of the favor of the higher powers and spirits of the sky. While the soldiers in the forts felt depressed, the Indians felt a surge of strength. For them, a thunderstorm was a time of maximum activity and spiritual uplift. Thunder was used by warriors as a natural signal to begin synchronized actions. During moments of powerful discharges, they could shout commands or make loud movements. The noise of the elements concealed any sounds of combat that might arise during the raid. This created an effect of complete surprise and mystical terror in the enemy. Flashes of lightning momentarily illuminated the landscape, allowing the warriors to orient themselves. They fixed the position of their targets in the brief seconds of light, then disappeared into the darkness again. To the enemy, it looked as if shadows were materializing out of nowhere and then dissolving again. Such tactics caused enormous psychological damage to unprepared people. The Indians knew that in heavy rain, people instinctively seek warmth and shelter. Soldiers gathered around fires or hid under awnings, limiting their visibility. This allowed the warriors to surround the camps almost unnoticed by the guards. Nature itself drove the enemy into a trap from which it was difficult to escape. The psychology of fear of the elements was studied in detail by tribal leaders. They understood that a person struggling with cold and dampness is less inclined to heroic resistance. Their attention is focused on their own discomfort rather than on external threats. The Indians skillfully exploited this human weakness. Where white people saw chaos and destruction, Native Americans saw order and opportunity. The storm cleansed the world and gave warriors a chance to reveal their true nature. This was the profound philosophy behind their warfare. They were children of the earth and sky in all their manifestations. Which side do you think ultimately had a better chance of winning in such conditions? Could modern technology replace the deep intuition that these warriors possessed? In the next chapter, you will learn how they coped with the terrible weather. Rain at night sharply lowered the air temperature, creating special conditions for camouflage. Native Americans knew that moist air conducts human body odors much less effectively. This was critically important when trying to approach a camp where guard dogs were stationed. Cold water literally pressed all vapors to the surface of the earth. Warriors rubbed their bodies with special compounds based on bear or deer fat. This substance worked like a modern wetsuit, retaining the body's internal heat in icy water. It also prevented the skin from getting wet and losing sensitivity from prolonged exposure to rain. The fat created a thin film that repelled moisture and dirt. The use of fat had another important aspect in the tactics of invisibility. It masked the natural scent of a person, replacing it with the scent of a wild animal or forest. Dogs often confused a sneaking warrior with a passing coyote or large beast. This allowed them to approach their target at arm's length. The damp soil also absorbed heat radiation from the body, if anyone could detect it. Although there were no thermal imagers at the time, the Indians intuitively understood the laws of heat transfer. They tried to press themselves against wet rocks or trees to blend in with the general temperature background. This made their silhouettes even more blurred in the dark. The night cold forced the enemy to build large fires to heat their tents. The smoke and light from these fires became ideal beacons for attackers. The Indians, on the other hand, could bypass such camps by staying in the shadows of the cold forest. They used the enemy's heat against them. The ability to endure low temperatures without warm clothing was part of their harsh training. From an early age, they hardened their bodies by bathing in cold springs and despising excessive comfort. This allowed them to maintain clarity of mind and precision of movement in conditions where others were shivering from the cold. Physical endurance was their biological weapon. Cold air currents in the lowlands could indicate the direction of the nearest water. The Indians used this knowledge to navigate in conditions of limited visibility. They felt the slightest changes in temperature with their skin, like a sensitive instrument. Nature itself showed them the way through the darkness and cold. To conclude this chapter, it is worth noting that the cold was not their enemy, but a strict teacher. It weeded out the weak and tempered those who were ready to fight for their land. In the conditions of night rain, this tempering was fully manifested. They were the true masters of the night. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how water changed the landscape in a matter of hours? Night rains turned dry creeks into raging torrents, creating natural barriers to pursuit. The Indians knew the places where the water level rose fastest due to the terrain. They used this knowledge to effectively cut off the pursuit after a successful raid. They crossed the riverbed at the last moment before it became completely impassable. This required perfect knowledge of geography and an understanding of how precipitation is distributed across slopes. A nighttime downpour could turn an ordinary lowland into an impassable swamp in a matter of minutes. Indigenous peoples used their knowledge to maneuver where the enemy was paralyzed. Indian horses were trained to swim across turbulent rivers in complete darkness. The warriors trusted their animals, which could sense the bottom and the strength of the current better than any human. At that time, cavalry horses were often frightened by the sound of water and refused to enter the stream. This created an insurmountable gap between the pursued and the pursuers. Warriors often used stream beds as roads during rain. The water hid their tracks and muffled the sound of hooves on the stones at the bottom. They could travel for miles through the water and then come ashore in the most unexpected place. For an inexperienced tracker, such a trail would end suddenly and forever. Even ordinary puddles on the trail could be used to mislead. The Indians passed through them in a special way to create a false impression of the number of horsemen. Mud and water were excellent materials for creating visual illusions on the ground. The enemy spent hours studying tracks that led nowhere. The ability to determine the depth of a ford by the sound of flowing water was a basic skill. In the dark and in the rain, vision failed, but hearing became incredibly sharp. They could hear the tone of the stream change when it encountered obstacles under the water. This allowed them to find safe crossings where others saw only danger. In the next chapter, we will take a detailed look at what kind of shelters helped them stay dry in the worst storms. Want to know how they survived in these harsh conditions without the houses we are used to? How difficult do you think it was to build such dwellings? The design of teepees and longhouses was perfectly adapted to prevent rain from becoming a problem. In Tipis, the upper flaps were adjusted so that smoke could escape and water could run down the outside. At night, when it started to rain, the camp's inhabitants could quickly change the angle of the poles for better drainage. Moisture caused the leather straps to tighten, making the structure even more stable. Inside the teepee, there was always a dry space for sleeping and storing valuable gunpowder. The Indians used inner curtains, which created an additional air layer and protected against condensation. This allowed them to rest in the warmth while the elements raged outside. The ability to keep the fire dry was a vital skill in such conditions. It is important to note that Native Americans knew how to build drainage ditches around their dwellings. They directed water away from the entrance and sleeping areas using the natural slope of the ground. This prevented flooding and kept the floor dry and livable. Such simple solutions were the result of thousands of years of experience living on the land. Even their clothing was part of the system of protection from moisture at night. Moccasins and leggings were often treated with fat so that water simply rolled off them. Wool blankets obtained through trade were also valued for their ability to keep warm, even when wet. They combined traditional materials with new ones to achieve the best results. Night shelters were always kept tidy so that they could be quickly assembled in case of an emergency. Every weapon and piece of equipment had its own specific place. Rain outside should not slow down a warrior's response to a possible threat. Discipline in everyday life was the key to the safety of the entire community. The ability to determine the reliability of the soil before building a house was critically important. The Indians avoided places prone to landslides or sudden floods that occurred after heavy rains. They read the landscape and understood where the water would go in the event of a major storm. This knowledge saved thousands of lives over the centuries. Living in harmony with precipitation was part of their overall strategy for prosperity. They did not try to defeat nature, but rather integrated themselves into its rhythms and cycles. Rain was just another phase in the life of the Great Prairies, for which they were prepared. It was true architecture of survival in the wild. Rain at night was a time to gather important raw materials that were difficult to obtain in dry weather. For example, certain types of bark were easier to separate from the trunk when the tree was saturated with moisture. Warriors used nighttime showers to replenish their water supplies in leather bags without the risk of being seen. Moisture also caused certain types of medicinal plants and roots to come to the surface. Wild honey was also sometimes collected in rainy weather, when bees were less active. Water prevented insects from flying and defending their nests from humans. This allowed honey hunters to collect the valuable product with less risk to their health. The sweet treat was an important addition to the diet of warriors and children. Rain helped to reveal hidden nests of birds and small animals by the specific behavior of their inhabitants. The Indians observed how nature reacted to water and found new sources of food. It was a time of intense observation of the life of the forest and the plains. Every drop opened up new opportunities for the attentive eye. The Indians also collected rainwater for special rituals of ablution and purification. It was believed that heavenly water possessed a special purity and power unavailable to earthly sources. It was stored in special vessels and used in the most important tribal ceremonies. It was a connection to the higher worlds through the elements. Night and rain created an atmosphere of solitude and focus on work. At this time, people often exchanged stories and knowledge while working side by side. The joint gathering of resources strengthened social ties within the community. Everyone contributed, despite the harsh weather outside the walls of their homes. Nature itself offered its gifts to those who were not afraid to get wet. The Indians were grateful recipients of these blessings, knowing the value of every drop. Rain was a time of abundance for them, not deprivation. They respected this cycle and knew how to get the most out of it. Navigating in complete darkness during rain required keen senses and experience. Native Americans knew how to determine the type of surface by the sound of raindrops hitting it. Grass, rocks, or bare earth sounded different depending on the intensity of the downpour. This allowed them to maintain their direction of travel when visibility was virtually zero. Moisture in the air changed the density of sound waves, making them more distinct. An experienced warrior could determine the distance to the nearest forest or rocky outcrop by ear. The echoes from raindrops hitting obstacles served as a kind of sonar for navigation. They read the sound map of the world as easily as we read signs. The wind accompanying the rain also provided important clues about the direction of the compass points. The Indians knew the wind rows of their region and understood where storms usually came from. The direction of the raindrops falling on their faces served as a reliable compass for experienced travelers. They always knew where they were going, even if they couldn't see their own hands. Even the smell of ozone and wet dust helped them navigate the endless plains. Different types of soil emitted specific aromas when wet, familiar to every hunter. They literally sniffed their way through the darkness and bad weather, orienting themselves by the smells of the earth. It was a multi-sensory system of perceiving reality. The warriors used animal sounds, which also changed depending on the precipitation. Birds and beasts sounded different alarms or calls when the sky cried. The Indians understood this language of the forest and took it into account when planning their movements. Animals were their unwitting allies in night reconnaissance. Sometimes they used special landmarks made of stones that could be felt with the foot or hand. In the rain, these landmarks became slippery, but still remained reliable points on the map. Their knowledge of the territory allowed them to find these markers even in the heaviest downpour. Their map of the world was imprinted directly in their memory. To conclude this chapter, it is worth saying that navigation in the rain was the highest art of the tracker. It required the synthesis of all the senses and a deep understanding of the laws of nature. Those who mastered this skill never got lost on their native land. They were part of the landscape, its living continuation. Concluding our story, we cannot fail to mention the spiritual perception of night rain. Thunder and lightning were considered manifestations of the powers of the thunderers, mighty spirits who purified the world. Night rituals during thunderstorms were aimed at obtaining sacred visions and power. Rain was perceived as a process of renewal, washing away the tribe's old failures and illnesses. Warriors believed that water falling from the sky in the dark possessed special magical energy. It could make them invisible to their enemies and protect them from bullets in battle. Many ritual dances were performed in anticipation of the first rain after a long drought. It was a time of great gratitude to the higher powers for the gift of life and fertility. Rain also symbolized the tears of ancestors who rejoiced in the successes of their descendants or mourned their losses. This created an invisible but strong connection between the past and future of the people. Each downpour was a reminder that they were not alone on this vast land. The spiritual world permeated every drop that fell on the dry soil of the prairies. The tribe's shamans used rainwater to prepare special potions and paints for rituals. They believed that the energy of the storm was preserved in the water and transferred to those who used it. Such items possessed increased power and helped in communicating with the spirit world. Nature was the main supplier of ingredients for their magic. Night rain often became a time for deep reflection and prayer in the silence of the teepee. People listened to the voice of the sky and sought answers to important questions in their lives. At this time, doors to other worlds opened and the wisdom of the ancestors became accessible. The sound of rain was the perfect backdrop for inner searching and self-discovery. Their legacy teaches us to respect the forces of nature and seek support in them, rather than seeing them as a threat. Rain, which for many today is just a nuisance, was a great gift from heaven for them. We hope this story has helped you better understand the soul of Native Americans. Their wisdom is still relevant today. We have looked at the unique techniques that allowed indigenous peoples to use night rain to their advantage. Their ability to turn adversity into advantage is the highest manifestation of human ingenuity and connection with nature. The Indians of the Great Plains proved that knowledge of the world around us can be stronger than any weapon. Which of these tactics did you find most interesting or unusual? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new exciting research into the history and daily life of ancient peoples.